Well, hey gang, we're back for another story in our journey through the Bible. It's been incredible so far. And in our last video, we left off with the Israelites being given the 10 Commandments at the base of Mount Sinai. Things were looking pretty good, right? God had just set his people free from slavery using some amazing signs and wonders that we find in the book of Exodus. He led them through the Red Sea by splitting it down the middle. And then he wanted to make a covenant with them where he would be their God and they would be his people. After this fantastic display of power and affection for his people, you would think that they would continue to follow after God, right? That they would obey all that God had instructed them. However, that isn't how things go. Almost immediately, actually it's a little before this, after they make this covenant, God making this covenant with Israel, Israel cheats on God by making a golden calf and they worship it, an idol, right? The first few commandments are like, thou shalt not have any other idols. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And they go off and create this golden calf and worship it because Moses, in their opinion, takes too long up on the mountain. Something must have happened. And so they convince Aaron to make a golden calf, and that is what they worship. But something crazy happened. God chose not to abandon his people. He wanted to continue to provide a way for them to be in relationship with him. God desires to be close with us. He desires union. And that brings us to our story today. Today we're exploring an account from the book of Leviticus. And I get it, most people struggle with this book on a good day, right? It is filled with rituals and processes that God provided to his people so that they could be holy as he is holy. There are processes to make yourself clean after becoming unclean for whatever reason that might be. There are processes for sacrifices if there were sins committed. There were love offerings and gift offerings and, aroma offerings, all sorts of offerings. And it can be pretty repetitive throughout the book of Leviticus, but the book is rich and full of meaning. And we have to remember that this was written to a people who didn't have, and the culture and the lives of people around them were vastly different than the way God was wanted his people to conduct themselves. And so our story today is nestled right in the middle of the book of Leviticus in chapter 16. It outlines the ritual process that is known as the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, if you've heard that. And once the Israelites built the tent of meeting, God would manifest himself inside of that tent. And it was called, where he went, the very center of it was called the Holy of Holies. It was the innermost sanctum of the tent of meeting, and no one was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. Otherwise, God's holiness would kill them. Not out of punishment, but because God's holiness would utterly destroy anything that was not holy. His holiness could not abide, with sin and the uncleanness. And at the time of our story, Aaron, Moses' brother, was high priest over Israel. And he was given a whole ritual process for himself that he needed to go through. And one of those, after bathing, after placing on holy garments, he had to perform certain sacrifices, and then he could enter and make atonement for all of Israel. However, during the ritual of the Day of Atonement, this is the one day out of the entire year that anyone can enter into the Holy of Holies, and it can only be the high priest. And the purpose of the Day of Atonement was to cleanse Israel from all of its sins. Even though there were daily rituals and daily sacrifices for this day cleansed everything. It essentially wiped the plate clean. Even though they would make sacrifices daily, this one day freed them from everything, at least for another year. And that brings us to our theme for today's story, and that theme is forgiveness. God wanted to provide a way for us to experience his forgiveness. And we get the sense that when this day was over, the people could take a massive sigh of relief that God had forgiven them. Like I said, at least for a year, and at least for the next 30 minutes as you didn't argue with your spouse on the way home, right? But it leads to the question, how important is forgiveness? I mean, studies have shown very recently that people who practice forgiveness and deal with the deep traumas and forgive others, they experience greater joy in their lives, whether you're a religious person or not. I mean, for corporations, this leads to higher levels of creativity and productivity while simultaneously lowering the rate of burnout and overload. Fortune 500 corporations and many other secular businesses are sending their people on retreats where they're learning about forgiveness because they've recognized how much better the workplace is, how much better people are able to produce when they're not carrying around the grudges, the traumas, and the hate. I mean, I could do an entire video series on the power of forgiveness. It highlights the importance of extending forgiveness to others and receiving that forgiveness for ourselves. And I've heard many stories of people who have carried around guilt of their actions, of their choices, but when they experience the forgiveness of Jesus, the weight lifted off their shoulders, and they've experienced true freedom. I mean, I once had a lady in our Kingdom Story Experience class who was married to a pastor, and this pastor cheated on her. Well, when this all came out that the pastor was actually practiced infidelity, they really didn't punish the pastor. They actually excommunicated the wife, the one who was the victim kind of in this place. And she carried around guilt for almost 40 years, believing that somehow she had caused the problem. But after studying our story today, and she was a devout Jesus follower, she loves Jesus, she knows Jesus has forgiven her, but something about this story made her realize that she needed to forgive herself. And not because she had done anything wrong, but that because she was believing this lie, that somehow she had done something wrong and was carrying around the guilt and shame of this. And she was finally set free. She's in her 80s, and she was finally set free of this. I mean, forgiveness is huge, and today's story helps us see that from an Old Testament perspective. Right, and today's story, scripture story, has many confusing elements if you read through it. There's a lot of repetition that can cause us to check out and just kind of skip over. But I encourage you to read it slowly and to let it sink deep within you, because Jesus fulfills this entire story in his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. Now, as I mentioned before, Aaron, the high priest, must do a ritual washing. He has to put on these holy garments, and he has to sacrifice some animals to cleanse himself so that he can lead this ritual for Israel. And God is not trying to give them several hoops to jump through. He is stressing the importance of his holiness and that corruption cannot abide with his holiness. So we have to take steps to cleanse ourselves before coming into his presence. So once Aaron is purified, he then takes steps to purify the altar, the tabernacle, and the tent, and the mercy seat inside of the Holy of Holies. You know, and I've heard it said in other sermons that the Levites were well acquainted with blood and knew how to handle it to bring God's reconciliation to his people. And I mean, again, to our modern senses, like this entire day would seem really out of place, right? We don't see animals slaughtered. We don't see blood being sprinkled everywhere. We're not used to that. But this ritual was so meaningful to the people of Israel as God was teaching them and growing them up, and became an important ritual as time goes on. It is still practiced today, not in the sense of sacrifice, but in a sense where the Jews come into the synagogue and they pray. They have turned this into a day of prayer and confessing, of their sins for God's cleansing. And once Aaron and the space were clean, he could perform the ritual of casting the sins upon two specific goats that are talked about. They would slaughter the first goat as a sin offering. And then Aaron would place his hands on the other goat's head and pronounce the sins of Israel over it. He was in a way transferring all of the sin from Israel to the goat. He was acting as a mediator, right? And passing the sins on to the goat. Well, then the goat would be then released into the wilderness, where he was to return to what is said in the Bible is Azazel. Well, it doesn't define, who that is, but if you do some research, you see that in the ancient world, Azazel was a demon goat god. So the significance of sending the goat into the wilderness is that Israel and God were sending the sin back to its origin, back to the place that it came from. They were returning it back to Azazel. Well, as the ritual kind of evolved over time during the reign of Solomon, when the first temple was built and they began, to do this ritual using the temple, the goat that would be led out would be led to the edge of a cliff. And, it doesn't say whether they pushed the goat off the cliff, whether they coaxed the goat off the edge of the cliff. But once the goat went off the edge of the cliff and basically killed itself, by dying, then the man that led the goat out there would kind of holler back, towards Jerusalem, and this kind of telephone would send its way back to Jerusalem. Once the people in Jerusalem heard that the goat had gone off the hill, off the edge of the cliff, they would begin to rejoice and celebrate and yell and and enjoy their newfound freedom, that the sins had been cast off into the wilderness. Well, after that process was done, after they cast the goat into the wilderness, Aaron and the person designated to release the goat, they needed to be cleansed again in order to kind of re-enter fellowship. And the holy garments needed to be removed off of Aaron, and Aaron could put back on his regular clothes. But I just want you to pause and think about just kind of the detail that is within this particular passage if you read through Leviticus 16, and to think about, if you just pause and think about the pressure that was on Aaron to have to lead this particular ceremony, right? It's only him that can enter into the Holy of Holies. It's only him that can mediate and provide, be the kind of mediator that provides atonement for his people. And furthermore, if he missed a step of any of this process, then he would be struck down by God's holiness. Again, not because of punishment, but because, as God told him, in a previous chapter in Leviticus, we see that God struck down 2 of Aaron's sons because they just approached God without thinking, with disregard, with no regard for his holiness. And that's what we can't do. God does not desire to punish us. He wants us to be in relationship with him, which is why he's providing this ritual. And I think even though there was pressure, Aaron longed for the feeling of finishing this job, right? Because then he and his people would be absolved of all of their sins, at least for the time being. Now, I don't know how much you know about the story of Jesus, but if you know a lot, you might see the parallels already that are here between Jesus and this story and what Jesus fulfilled. Like the book of Hebrews first says that Jesus is our new high priest, right? So he takes the place of Aaron. He's the one that's going to mediate between God and us and pass the sins, right? He can enter the Holy of Holies. Right now, the book of Hebrews tells us that he is in the Holy of Holies, making atonement for us daily, right? He intercedes on our behalf as Aaron did. Well, Jesus was also crucified, right? So he is the slaughtered goat. He is the sin offering for us. And we also see that Jesus took upon himself all of the sins of the human race, right? He was the goat, the second goat was led out into the wilderness, right? Jesus was led outside of the city and up onto the hill of Golgotha, which is where he was crucified, sort of a wilderness, archetype. And we see that Jesus, again, he not only takes on the sins for the year, but he takes on the sins since the time of Adam and Eve until the time of renewal in the book, which is in the book of Revelation, right? Jesus' blood is the atoning sacrifice that brings us back into our relationship with God. And as I've been saying, right, this story is so rich and full of meaning. It lays the foundation and the groundwork for what Jesus is going to do. Now, as we move into the character of God, there are plenty of insights into God's character in this story. First and foremost is God's holiness, right? He is so completely set apart from us that he needed to create a bridge for us to be able to come close to him, for us to come back in relationship to him. Remember, he desires that we be close. And that we must understand both of these things, his holiness and his desire to be close, right? We have to realize that he is holy, that he is set apart. He is different than the way we often choose to live our lives, and he thinks differently than the way we think on earth. But we also need to understand that while he is holy and set apart, he deeply desires to be in relationship with us, to be close to us, right? He wouldn't have created us to begin with if he didn't want to be in relationship with us. However, we tanked the whole thing in the beginning, so God needed to create this bridge. He needed to create this way for us to be close. He needed to train us in his holiness and make us aware of the depth of the disease of sin that is within us. Right? Union is what God desires. That's what this story highlights, is union, God's forgiveness of our sins so that we could come into union with him again. We see how Jesus once and for all establishes this bridge that I've been talking about, and this bridge cannot be torn down. Right? But like any parent raising a child, there is a time and a place for each lesson. And so Jesus comes at the exact time God had planted, which matched the development of his people in the world. Right? So a lot of people ask, why didn't Jesus just come earlier? Why didn't God do that to atone for the sins? We needed to grow up. We needed to come to a place, even though we rejected Jesus, there were many things that we understood about God that made it the right time for Jesus to come. And we got to remember that God is a forgiving God. That's why this story, this theme is about forgiveness. God is a forgiving God. He is slow to anger and he abounds in faithfulness. And this character trait of forgiveness is a gift that God has given us. One we can receive from him, and one we could and should give to each other and ourselves when wrongs have been committed against us. Hanging on to grudges and holding hate within us is toxic to ourselves, and it does nothing to the person that we're holding resentment against. That person's going on with their day, yet I am being torn up inside because of the hate and the resentment that I'm holding, in here. Holding unforgiveness allows someone else to rent space in your head for free. Not okay, right? That's why we need to practice forgiveness. Having them take space in your head rent-free like that, it sucks the life out of you. We must be people that practice forgiveness, if for no other reason than for our own health. But the only way that it's going to do that is if it's true forgiveness. And as I mentioned before, forgiveness is a vast topic. So let me know if you want me to do a video simply on forgiveness, right? But this leads me all to our challenge for this week, right? Is there a place where you need to forgive someone? Is there a place where you've been holding a grudge? And if you're honest, it's been draining the life out of you. If you really take a deep look at those places where you've not forgiven somebody as much as you want to hold on to that hate, I bet you that it's draining you of the life. It's zapping your joy. You aren't able to see the good things that are surrounding you. You aren't able to live the full life that you want to live, right? So I challenge you to forgive that person this week. Now, you don't need to make contact, right? Just like one of the 12 steps, you want to extend forgiveness, but only where it doesn't hurt them, right? If it's you that's bothered by that, where you just don't want to face the shame, well, then I think we need to take baby steps in that. But the first step is at least moving forward and saying, you know what, I forgive the person, for this. And I want you to make an honest attempt. It may just be saying the words, even though you don't mean them. You might have to do it 1,000 times. That's what I like about the movie, The Shack, in there as God is speaking to him. He's like, you say the words, and you may have to forgive them 1,000 times before your heart really releases that anger. But we have to take that step. We have to move forward in it. Perhaps maybe you need to come forward and ask somebody else for forgiveness for a wrong that you've done to them. I have hurt so many people throughout my life, and I'm on the journey to tell these individuals that I'm sorry and that I ask for their forgiveness. Now, they may give it, they may not, but that's not the point. The point is that we recognize what we have done. We extend our hand of apology. And again, we don't want to hurt the person further by bringing this up. And so you have to discern whether you actually need to make contact with this or not. But we need to make amends for the places where we have done wrong. So I challenge you to do the same. If there's places where you've wronged, to extend the hand and to say, you know what, I'm sorry for what I did to you. I apologize. Will you forgive me? And if they don't, they don't. But at least you have stepped forward and know that that is an area where you have tried to build the bridge. And if they don't want to build it, that's fine. Again, the point isn't for them to forgive you. The point is that you own up to what it is that you've done. God is a God of forgiveness. So let us practice it and be examples of what it means to forgive. We can change households, we can change communities simply by this one practice. The Old and the New Testament are so woven together. It's important that we know the story. And I pray that this story and this video has shed new light on an Old Testament book, on an Old Testament passage, and helps us see the connections of the both. We'll be blessed, you guys. I hope you continue to find your place in God's story.